Morning, everyone. We are 1 week away from the end of the Bible. And today we are doing two chapters from the story, chapters 29 and 30, Paul's missionary journeys and Paul's martyrdom. I did not have much notice that I would be teaching today, so we're going to wing it. You all have some maps in front of you, and last week we ended sort of the Acts of the Apostles. That's more or less where we were at the end of the Bible. And so this week we are going to look at all of the letters that happened between the Acts of the Apostles and Revelation. And so it's a lot of material, too much that we really can't do a lot of detail, so we're going to try and do broad strokes and then drill down where appropriate. So to summarize everything that's happening in today's chapters, the church is spreading. Disciples are traveling all over the world, or the known world, the Roman Empire, and planting churches. In the first half of the Acts of the Apostles, we hear mostly about Peter. Peter, of course, that link to Jesus directly. And Peter is going about preaching. But Peter is not really the great church planter. Peter is really just a preacher. Right at about halfway through the Acts of the Apostles, there's a shift away from Peter and toward Paul. Paul is a true church planter. Paul, as we said at the very end of last week, as Dr. Gray said at the end of last week, Paul was present as Stephen was martyred. Stephen, the first Christian martyr, and he was there to see Stephen stoned. And so Paul is a persecutor of the church. Paul, after Stephen is stoned, actually receives permission to go and to seek out and arrest Christians. And so as he is beginning that mission to go and find and arrest Christians, he is knocked off his horse by a blinding light, and he is made blind. But once he comes to, he realizes that he has met Jesus in the flesh, that he has seen Jesus, and that this story that these Christians are telling is actually true. And so his whole life is turned upside down, and he begins to plant churches all over the world. Which brings us to your map. So if you look at your map, Paul made 3 major missionary journeys, and then a 4th major journey was after he was arrested in his trip to Rome. The 3 journeys, as you see, orange, and then red, and then yellow, gradually get larger in scale. He gets a little farther and farther away from Judea. So let's have a word about Paul. Paul was a very well-educated Jew. He lived in Jerusalem, or he was at least familiar with that area, but he was most likely educated in Rome. He came from a wealthy family, and so he received a very classic education. He was articulate, he was knowledgeable about philosophy, he was knowledgeable about Roman culture, and so it put him in a very good position to ultimately do what he did, which is he was really the preacher to the Gentiles, so to speak. He went beyond Judea, where the core of the Jewish people were, and went to all the places where the Gentile Romans were in order to spread this good news. But because he was Jewish, he was able to make links between Jesus from a Jewish perspective and the prophetic identity that he had, but also make links to the universality of Jesus' message, that this was not just for the Jewish people, but for all people. So Paul begins making these missionary journeys. His first missionary journey was in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. Paul travels around to some major churches and begins to plant churches. If you look on your map, you see a few red cities. I guess they're orange, perhaps. Those are the major churches that he planted, the 7 churches of Asia. And that's what he did in these first 2 missionary journeys. A few of these churches we know about because he wrote letters to them. A quick aside, The Epistles, all of those little books that we have between Acts of the Apostles and Revelation, they are all actually just letters. Because if you put yourself in their position, Paul goes around preaching this good news to the people. He plants churches in major cities all over the Roman Empire. But naturally, these people are trying to wrestle with what it means to follow Jesus. And as questions arise, and they get into conflicts, I know it's hard to believe that churches would be in conflict, Paul writes to them to try and answer these questions. And so there are lots of questions that Paul wrestles with, including questions of what it means to be Christian if you are not Jewish. Remember, up to now, Jesus was Jewish, and he spoke and he taught in ways that really emphasized knowledge of Jewish scripture. One of the reasons why we preach on Sunday morning is to try and illuminate the truth in these gospel stories that goes beyond just Jewish scriptural tradition. Yes, it's there. We root it there. We want to flesh it out there. But we also want to make sure that it's applicable to us today because we are not Jewish. At least most of us aren't. And so Paul's trying to do the same thing. As he plants these churches, he goes away, and these churches will write to him with questions like, do you have to be circumcised in order to be Christian? Because you certainly had to be circumcised in order to be Jewish. That's a major bone of contention, which is totally understandable. People don't want to do that if they haven't been. There are also questions of how to eat meat, because there are many dietary restrictions within the Jewish law, and people are wondering, can we do what we've always done, simply believing something new, or do we have to adhere to a lot of these Jewish laws from which Jesus came? And so Paul writes all these letters, and we get a lot of these letters. Ephesians, that's to the church in Ephesus. We get Philippians, to the church in Philippi. Corinthians, to the church in Corinth. All of these letters, epistle just simply means letter. All of these letters are meant to address specific questions to specific communities in a specific place and time. That is where we get into some difficulty today when we look at interpreting these epistles, because many of the epistles deal with a very specific question that may or may not be applicable to us today. And that's where oftentimes we get into denominational shifts in church today, because people have read a particular line in a particular letter and believe that that is potentially universally true in all ways, when if taken as a whole, it may not be. Okay. Any questions so far? All right, after his first missionary journey, Paul typically returns back to his home. If you look all the way to the right-hand side of your map, you'll see that there are a number of cities. Antioch is right next to the word Syria. Antioch is a very common place for Paul to find himself. It's where he based a few of his missionary journeys. And that's where he spent most of his time when he wasn't out planting churches. After his first two missionary journeys, Paul returns to Jerusalem. And he realizes that Jerusalem is likely going to be where he will end his life. But he decides to go on a final and third missionary journey. And this one takes him as far over as Macedonia, where he's able to touch base with all of these churches that he's planted. If you look over in the Greece, Macedonia area, you'll likely see Corinth to the south, a major church, Philippi to the north. Those are two of his very largest churches. Corinth was an interesting, yes? His journeys probably take place over about 15 to 20 years. And so he is mostly traveling during this second part of his life. There are a few churches that he plants very quickly and a few where he stays for a while. In Ephesus, he stays for 2 years. In Corinth, he stays for about a year and a half. So he's not simply showing up for a tent revival for 3 or 5 days. He is staying in these communities, living with them for multiple years in order to establish their churches. The larger cities like Ephesus, Philippi, Corinth were the ones he invested the most amount of time. Corinth is an interesting city because Corinth was likely the most like our current American cities. You know, first century Corinth is very much like 21st century America. It was very metropolitan, a center of trade, very wealthy, affluent, well-educated, and Corinthians, the letter to the Corinthians, is probably the most helpful to us as modern American Christians because it deals with issues of pride, issues of wealth, issues of social status, all of the things that we wrestle with most often, even though we may not even know we wrestle with them. The things that keep us from actually engaging in a life of faith in the deepest way we can. And so Paul's wrestling with a lot of modern ideas, which is why his letters resonate with people today and why they still inspire a lot of directions and philosophies within different Christian denominations. Any other questions after that? So Paul is problematic. Paul is very well educated. He is able to navigate a sophisticated contemporary culture in the Roman Empire, and he causes a lot of problems for the leadership, for the Roman authorities. Paul makes it back after his third missionary journey to Jerusalem, and it is in Jerusalem where Paul is arrested. Paul is arrested and placed in jail, and he is relatively certain that he's going to be killed and put to death. And so what he does is he calls on an old Roman law, which allows a Roman citizen, which he was, to appeal to Rome, to the Senate, to the Caesar, to the emperor, to have a trial in Rome rather than a trial somewhere else in the empire. And so because he appeals to this and he is a Roman citizen, he has to get from Jerusalem back to Rome in order to be tried for his treason, for doing what is illegal, which is being Christian. And so on that final journey back to Rome, Paul writes a number of his last letters. You are likely familiar in the Bible that there are first letters of Paul and second letters of Paul, a number of places like the Corinthians. Those second letters, most of them were written while he was imprisoned on his way to Rome. And so what you get in those letters are instances of Paul trying to leave a legacy with the churches that inspire them to continue the energy that they have. It's easy to get people excited over a new idea. It's a whole lot harder to continue to engage and inspire and excite people over time. And Paul realizes that's going to be a struggle for the church beyond this. And so he writes these second letters while he is basically in a cell on the way from Jerusalem back to Rome. When he gets to Rome, Paul is tried and convicted and executed. One of the interesting things about the Bible is that we do not have the stories of Peter or Paul's deaths. We have tradition about the way that they were killed. Peter, tradition holds, was going to be crucified in Rome and told his captors that he could not die. He was not worthy to die the same way as Jesus, and so he was crucified upside down. Paul, we have no real tradition about his death, except that at the time, he likely would have simply been beheaded quickly, because that's the way that Roman citizens would have been executed. It was a little more dignified, less painful. And so this whole section ends with Paul and Peter's deaths. I'm going to talk about some of the other disciples in a minute, but are there any questions specifically about Paul? Mm-hmm. What language did Paul speak? Paul, because he was well educated in Rome, would have likely been multilingual for sure. Because he's Jewish, I'm sure he spoke Hebrew, and most scholars know that he would have spoken Greek. He wrote in Greek. Those are his letters, and it's very good Greek. One of the reasons Paul, because of his education, was able to raise up a very thoughtful and affluent group of Christians, one of whom was Luke. Most scholars think that the author of Luke and Acts, the same person, was likely a disciple of Paul. And so he was hearing stories about Jesus sort of secondhand. And he was hearing Paul preach and tell these stories, and then ended up writing his Gospels. Because of that, and because of the other letters that we have in the initial language, we know that Paul was well educated. Same thing with Luke. You know, people like to say that Luke was a physician. We have no real reason to think that. I mean, you can sort of imply some things in the scriptures, but Luke was definitely well educated, because for most scholars would point to Luke as one of the most excellent examples of classic Greek literature that exists, period, not just in the Bible. It is so well written, and the complexity is so high that he had to have been well educated, and that's why people have historically said that he was likely a physician. Something to keep in mind, the time scale here. When you open up your New Testament, first book you see is Matthew. You get Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John at the beginning. But something to remember is those 4 books were written at or after all of the other epistles in the New Testament. Now, they put them ahead of the epistles because it tells the story of Jesus, which you sort of need to know in order for the epistles to make any sense. But the authors of the Gospels were likely disciples of the apostles, not of Jesus directly. When you read the Gospel stories, particularly Mark, it's very clear that that first generation of Jesus followers thought Jesus was coming back right now. I mean, he was going to return in their lifetime. And so they were desperate to spread this news all over the world as much as they could. It wasn't until they started dying that their followers began to realize, well, maybe Jesus is not coming back just yet. And so we need to write these stories down. And that's where we get the Gospels that we have in our canon. Now, they're not the only Gospels that were written. There are plenty, dozens of other Gospels written by people who likely knew Jesus directly. But either they didn't survive in whole, or they simply were never authoritative in the same way that these 4 are that we find in our canon. But they're all available. You could Google and read them on your computer easily. Many of those also emphasized a human Jesus in a way that the Gospels we have in our Bible now either balance the human and divine Jesus, or when you get to John, I mean, Jesus is just divine. I mean, there's very little of the human fault in Jesus in John, which is one of the reasons why Christians love John. You see John quoted all over the place. You see John on posters because it's a very high divine understanding of Jesus. Did you have a follow-up question?
Well, I think when the Greeks were powerful, they established
Hellenism. Mm-hmm.
Probably a lot of educated people.
For sure. It's likely that he may have known Latin as well, but his letters are in Greek. And because he was Jewish, he would have spoken and likely read and written Hebrew as well. But that's all we really have record of, is just Greek and Hebrew. Any other questions about Paul? So one big idea that helps us in church history is understanding that the apostles fanned out all over the empire. And each apostle went to a different part of the empire. What you have on your map is a very decent look at the Roman Empire. You know, the Roman Empire looms large in our history, but geographically, it didn't extend too far from the Mediterranean basin. And so what you see with Italy in the west, all the way around to North Africa down in the south, that was the primary region of the Roman Empire. The apostles, the original ones, they spread out, and each one of them went to a major city in the empire. Obviously, I think we know Peter went to Rome, which is why Rome is the center of the Roman Catholic Church, because Peter, and the Pope, official title is the Bishop of Rome, because Peter was the Bishop of Rome. But other apostles went to other cities. If you look at your map, you see places like Alexandria, Cyrene. They went all over and established churches in those different regions. One apostle left and went to India, and his name is Thomas. And so we have a spread of the apostles all over the world to create churches. Those churches today, many of them are Orthodox churches. So when we talk about the Roman Catholic Church and then the Eastern Orthodox churches, the Eastern Orthodox churches are really collections of churches that were each started or rooted in an apostle's teaching in a particular city. Almost all of the Eastern Orthodox churches are going to be in Greece, Turkey, and around the corner up into North Africa, where we get the Coptic Orthodox Egyptians. And that's what's happening in this phase of time in Christianity, where the apostles are spreading all over the Mediterranean to find churches. Each of those become an apostolic see. We as Episcopalians believe in apostolic succession, which means every clergy person, priest, and bishop have been touched by a person who was touched by a person who was touched by, all the way back to the apostles who were touched by Christ. And each of those churches, Orthodox and Roman Catholic and Anglican churches, all have that same kind of apostolic succession through their ordination. And that roots itself back to this phase of time. Other important people who were writing letters, Paul wrote the most. Peter wrote a few, and so did John. Both apostles, both writing letters to communities who are trying to establish themselves in good Christian practice. And it is John who gets himself in trouble, and he is arrested, and he is taken to prison on an island in the Mediterranean, Patmos, and it is there where John receives visions of amazing things, and that's where he writes a few of his letters, but also the letter of Revelation. Revelation is a vision from John, an apostle, that gives people a vision of the future, perhaps, a way of understanding what Christ has to do with us today and in the future. And that's where we're going to look next week. So any final questions about Paul and his journeys? Mm-hmm. We're not entirely sure, but we know that he stopped in different places. If you think about travel, they couldn't get on a plane and just go from Jerusalem to Rome. And so it's likely that he would have been in some sort of traveling cage, and he would have been on a ship, some of it. He would have been on the road, some of it. And whenever they would stop, people would come and see him. As a Roman citizen, there was sort of dignity about being in prison. You weren't maltreated. You had the ability to do things like write letters. And so what he would do is, beginning in Jerusalem, he wrote letters to the churches, to his friends, saying things like, "Pray for me." If you look at some of the letters like 2 Corinthians, it begins with, "I have been imprisoned, pray for me." And so these people realize that Paul is on his way to trial and likely execution. And so they come to visit him when he arrives in these different places. I mean, travel was just so much slower at that point that when you see that he stopped in southern Turkey, he would have been visited by Christians. And they likely would have had the opportunity to speak with him beyond just even letters because of the sense of dignity about being in prison if you're a Roman citizen. And so Paul had a very compelling life, which is, I think, why he has the imagination of people still today, he was a bad guy. He wasn't just a simple guy. You know, you've got the fishermen and those disciples, and they didn't quite understand stuff, and they put their foot in their mouths, and they did stuff like that. And so we can sort of relate to them. They weren't bad. I mean, Paul was a bad guy. He took advantage of people, all people, Jews, non-Jews, everyone. He capitalized on other people's misfortunes. And, I mean, to the point where he's there more or less assisting in Stephen's martyrdom. His conversion and subsequent church planting is so inspirational because it's really hard to think of yourself being more lost than Paul or doing worse things than Paul. I mean, killing a person for their faith, I don't know how you really get much worse than that. And so for Paul to be able to convert, to be able to change his life, and for Paul to be able to do so in a way that doesn't get stuck in, say, institutionalism, I think is a very big inspiration for people, which is why it still captivates their imaginations. If you think philosophically about this period of time, Paul and the others who are writing letters focus very much on how you do Christianity. They're not so focused. Yes, there is some talk of belief, and we certainly lift up those passages today because we're a belief-centered kind of culture right now. But the great majority of what Paul writes about is how to do this. What to eat, where to go, how to pray, how to treat one another, how to treat strangers. That's what he wrestles with. Their culture in this first century was very much faith-based in the sense that how you live is more important than what you believe. I think they would ascribe to sort of what makes Anglicanism unique, which is the way, not unique, but more ancient in the way we practice. We do the same thing over and over again, not because we're bored or because we can't really get creative, but because we think by the doing of those things, we are shaping who we are and what we believe. That's a very ancient Christian idea. That's what we see in Paul, is this focus on the doing. Because when you do it, you will believe it. Things shifted at the end of the first century, much more toward a belief structure. We see things like the rise of formation programs for baptism and membership. You know, there's not membership talk in a lot of the epistles. We see that shift at the end of the first century. After Paul has died, Peter has died, all those others have died, where having right belief is very important. Professing a specific kind of belief is important. And we see that manifest itself in the 4th century with the Council of Nicaea, because belief begins to be important, and for a couple hundred years, we have people wrestle with ideas like Jesus' divinity, or who was Mary, or what happened on the cross when Jesus died. Those kind of belief ideas become really important. When the church councils begin in the 4th and 5th centuries, each one wrestles with one of those major ideas, and it begins to develop a logical progression of Christian belief, where if we believe this, then we have to believe this next thing, and then we have to believe. So for example, if we believe that Jesus is both human and divine, 100%, then we have to say, how did Mary get involved with the birth of this God? So Mary can't just be normal, because it doesn't make any sense that a normal person could potentially bear God. So Mary must be special. And so if Mary is special, what does that mean about the rest of us? Well, Mary is likely not going to be sinful, because a sinful person could not bear God, but we probably are sinful. We know we are. And so are we born with that sin in order to, and then it kind of just the ball rolls down, which gives us things like original sin and that sort of stuff. All of that, by and large, is absent in the epistles. I would say that the apostles, not 100%, but greatly, the apostles emphasize what you do in life. and not what you believe. And I think we're getting back to that a little bit. I think that's one of the big cultural shifts that we're in right now, is if you look at, say, the oldest generation and the youngest generation, I think that's one of the biggest ways that they are different, is the oldest generation really does believe a particular thing, whereas younger generations want to do stuff. So things like coming to church on a Sunday morning is not doing what they want to do. Now, if it helps them do, that's great. But if it's just to go through the motions, it doesn't make any sense. And that's what the epistles are really wrestling with, particularly Paul. Any other questions about Paul? Oh, yes, absolutely. Good question. Are there historic records of the charges? The charges specifically, I don't know. But historic record of Paul having been a real person and doing all that stuff? Absolutely. There are a number of people, historians around the time. Josephus is a name that you may or may not know. Josephus is a first century historian, happens to be Jewish, but he was a, sort of like Paul, he was a very well-educated person from Judea who maintained history of the whole Roman Empire in the first century. And so we have historic records outside of the Bible of people like Jesus, Pilate, Peter, and Paul. These people really did exist. I mean, these sort of secular historians, so to speak, even though no one was secular at that time, but these historians with nothing to gain recorded the lives of these people. And so official charges like that a lawyer would be satisfied with, I have no idea. But well, the Romans were very good record keepers. And so when something isn't in the Roman record, it gives us pause, or it should, about whether that is true. But I think I said this at the very beginning when I taught the story last October. There's a difference between history and truth. And I think that we're getting less and less. We're getting farther away from where we wrestle with historicity and truth. And I think now we're in the phase of time where these people did live. I mean, they did this stuff. The stories they tell of the stuff they did might be, like the fish is this big sort of stuff, but it doesn't mean that it's not true and it didn't actually happen in some capacity. And so because of that, we can be relatively, I think, confident in reading these letters as real messages from real people, not just what has developed over time that we would like to say is real. I mean, that's what many of the Old Testament stories are. They're thoughtful retellings of stories. Thoughtful because over time, people realized what's really valuable about emphasizing in that story. And so when it's finally written down, that becomes the emphasis. That's a good thing, because those particular qualities to emphasize in those stories make them very helpful in the way that we live. This stuff, though, is pretty off the cuff. I mean, people didn't write letters like we write emails, but it's still just a letter that there is no way Paul expected these letters to be in a canon like the Bible informing us now. I mean, I just don't think that was a part of the mindset of those people. You write a letter to someone, it's just a letter. It's like all the correspondence between, Adams and Jefferson. Now you can read them all, but they likely weren't thinking that at the time. And so you have to take some of that into account. We have lots of things in Paul that trouble people. Gender roles, sexuality, authority, all of that stuff, race, all of that is problematic in Paul's letters. And if we take it at face value, we could keep from progressing in thoughtful ways toward a better future. But we can't throw it out without trying to figure out what Paul was trying to wrestle with when he said those things. He's a product of a culture. And so we have to know the culture in order to know who he is, to know what his biases were. But we can't just repeat the bias, or else we're not growing. Any other questions about Paul before we end?
There's some interesting paintings of Paul. You see in the museum of art. They always portray him as being bald. What's that mean?
Paul is being bald?
Bald,
Huh.
having hair on top.
I don't know anything about that.
Well, I think it's interesting. That's kind of in a museum. Check it out.
I'd be interested to know if they depict him as bald, if that's more of a manifestation of what they think a cleric would look like at the time they were painting the painting than any historic record. He probably wasn't bald. Good Jews aren't bald, you know. All right. Thank you all for being here. Enjoy your day.